Well, there's been a lot of talk at this conference about what constitutes Midwesternness, particularly in an intellectual. At the sincere risk of essentializing, I would submit that our afternoon keynote speaker might very well fit the bill. Joseph Amato has written or edited 14 books on rural, regional, and local history, including such titles as With Richard Davies and David Pichaski, A Place Called Home, Writings on the Midwestern Small Town. His interests go beyond the Midwest, however, and include cultural and intellectual history, beginning in 1975 with the publishing of his book Mounier and Maritain, A French Catholic Understanding of the Modern World, to this very year when Ellis Press released his recent title, The Book of Twos, The Powers of Contrasts, Polarities, and Contradictions. Having received his PhD from the University of Rochester in 1970, Amato began teaching at Southwest Minnesota State University straight away, where he was founder and chair of the history department. There, he began a career further defined by his wide-ranging interests. To reference just 2 of his 27 books, in 1982, he published Guilt and Gratitude, A History of the Origins of Modern Conscience. In 2002, Rethinking Home, The Case for Local History. We're very pleased to have him as our keynote speaker this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Amato.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone that made this conference possible. I want to thank friends that have shown up on purpose or by accident. And I particularly want to thank Dave Pichaski. He's back there. He publishes my books. We write books together, and we're part of a renaissance. There's a buddy that goes back to 1961 at Wayne State. We've been in a conversation that is continuous since then. And way back there, there's a young woman and well-known Minnesotan historian, Annette Adkins. And our conversation goes back to 1970. So I feel like I'm a little bit in a time warp here. But thanks to everyone. And I did not elaborate thanks to Joe, to Ann, and of course to Gleaves, but I mean it. And of course to the 2 Johns from South Dakota who have singularly, well, I don't know if singularly, but have centrally brought up this whole question of the Midwest. I've noticed all the speakers up here start and they're like a horse and they get galloping faster and faster. And sometimes I have the feeling they never get to the end of what they want to say. I'm going to start where I was planning to end and then gallop like heck through the center. And where I wanted to end, is with poetry. I've been writing more and more poetry because it's a hell of a lot more economical than prose. And when you get my age, a long revision can look on the other side of the graveyard. So poems. A poem that is not published, I can't even promise it's finished, is a very short poem on Sicily. I'm being drawn back into the cone of Etna. If I could take back from time what God so generously gave in flesh and form, and time stole back through accident, disease, chaos, and death, I would have life given in freshness and love be my daily Eucharist, and grace given memory the evening chalice of morrow's hope. That was why I'm writing about Sicily. My father is falling asleep, and he always complained he had trouble sleeping at night. That's because he sat in his easy chair from about 6 on, practicing up. So here's a little poem to my father called The Sicilian Father. His folks were from the mountains up above Palermo called the Madania. They were near the top. They were on the poor side of the villages. My father is again reclined in his recliner. He's reached the age of bad habits, constantly clearing his throats, twiddling his thumbs, insulting, finding fault, doing crossword puzzles, and dozing off. He's 70. Reclined in his recliner, he appears to be practicing dying. His face is long and drawn. His breath is deep, precarious, hesitant. He sleeps as if he is without dreams. As sons everywhere, I'm drawn to and repulsed by my sleeping father. Fleeing him, I seek out the land of his father and mother. In Sicily, at the Greek temple Segesta, raised 7 centuries before Christ, I observed how snails, circular temples themselves, once alive, now decorate the dead bleached white stems of bent scattered plants. There's one, a little more. The small birds fly in and out of the roofless, standing temple. They treat it like a clump of trees. They building nests on its highest ledges. I follow the shepherd and his flock higher up to the amphitheater that surveys the land and sea below. I sit on the highest row of curved stone among grazing sheep, asking what tragedies fed ancient Sicilians. I'm getting quite far away from the Midwest, I hope you understand. I'm going back to Detroit to visit family graves. My father died when he was 77. In August of this year, I'm 77. I didn't say it proves I'll die at 77, but we always live by diagnosis in all things. Here's a poem to what will be a subject here, if I can find it, to the cemetery on the east side of Detroit. It's called Mount Olivet. It's worthy of a Midwestern study, particularly an ethnic study and a Catholic study. There are 360,000 people buried in that cemetery, or 350. In that cemetery, there's a history of Detroit from about the 1870s, or just say 1860s onward. It's a great index. A trip to a Detroit cemetery. I wedge the door tight with the furniture of memory, especially my father's reading chair when I visit my native Detroit. But I cannot close the drafty cracks that run the threshold of my mind with rags and blankets of old stories. Winds, time's prying and fingering thieves, enter my childhood and tear out sheaves of its book. They spin up in whirlpools like autumn's gathered leaves. They float them across seasons over the high black wrought iron fence of Mount Olivet Cemetery, where my parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles lie, scarcely remembered under submerged flat stones. The leaves, like migrating butterflies, cluster and cross the east side, that's the east side of Detroit, between the spokes of Gratiot and Jefferson Avenue. Descending on the blocks, they lined and grid the palms of mind. The leaves settle in vacant yards and untended lots, where old immigrant houses once stood, blank and white, camouflaged among patches of retreating snow. They whisper nothing of this gray spring day to charred houses and passing figures. From behind pieced together rusty fences, mangy dogs that sleep in the empty hulls of discarded cars and the shadow of vacated premises bark. They sense apparitions, old ethnic foreigners like Cecilia and me, of Etna's ilk, who persist in remembering an arcing, sparking, arsenal, steel-making city, and rivers of burning, running embers. So those are 3 poems. Why I read them first? It's egotistic, it's autobiographical, and I hope it's decent poetry. But if I'm offered on a plate the chance to write Midwestern history, I'm going to have to construct it against East Detroit and another place, and I'll talk about that. So my talk is really about 2 places. I've done my thank yous, but I haven't told you I thank any and all of you who are keeping the variety of the past alive, because the variety of the past is much greater than the diversity of the present. That was a political comment, and it was fully meant to be that. It wasn't meant to be particularly polite. It was one of those mangy dogs. A Jewish rabbi of the 18th century wrote, "Forgetfulness leads to exile, while remembrance is the secret of redemption." It's a nice task. Annette Adkins, reviewing John Locke's work, wrote, "Yes, the current state of the discipline may feel chaotic, but what if we adopted Bob Dylan's philosophy? Chaos is a friend of mine," and explored where that would take us. I find that very interesting, that phrase. Pope John Paul wrote a poem prior to being Pope John Paul II in a book called Easter Vigil and Other Poems. And I don't quite understand this poem, but I'll read it to you, and one of you after it's over, if you have time, will come by and explain to me what it means. But the poem has a meaning for me, but I'm not sure exactly how. 2 cities. Each of the 2 cities is a whole, which cannot be carried from heart to heart. Each has to live at our heart's expense. In each of us. Unless we are wholly at one with one of the 2, we cannot exist and remain true. That is a perplexing idea about 2s. So that was evocations and provocations. Now on with the talk. It's easy to talk about the Midwest adjectively and say wonderful things. I mean, we could almost have a festival of the Midwest and just have banners and say wonderful things. It's the national heartland. It's home to decent, honest, and hardworking folks. Born whole and fresh like Athena out of the head and body of the Midwest, of the nation. The Midwest lacks the long, complex, meandering and class-encumbered past of New England and slavery sin stains of the tragic, divided, and sinful South. The Midwest is without Appalachian Mountains, inner side. I can augment superlatives about its virtue by overlooking the removal of native peoples, although when you're from southwest Minnesota, that gets tougher and tougher to do. Little thing, the 1862 war. And we can overlook the voyageurs' north-south mastery of the continent's rivers. I studied for a year in Quebec, and I'm still kind of caught by the early Canadian dream, or French dream, not Canadian, French dream, that North America should be organized in a north-south direction. None of this east-west stuff. Let us flow where the rivers go. And so, anyhow, I've done enough of that, but the Midwest did not gloat or pout over the past. It was a true place for a fresh start. Its genesis lay in its own work, determination, and ingenuity. The Midwest took full form after the Civil War. It carried forward what is best in the Republic. And it brought with us both republic and democracy onto the plains. And in that way, it was almost as if America, the plant, blossomed somewhere on the Midwest. Often the problem with this idealized Midwest, and I'm citing an article from the Daily Mail in 1985, is the trouble is that for most Americans, the Midwest, like other regional identities, is less a place on the map than a state of mind. That adds to its elusiveness, of course. I don't lend my own heart to writing about the Midwest now. I might have one years ago, if it would, but I'm still dealing with the Detroit of my childhood. And as I get older, those synapses hold. The more recent concatenations and the more recent conglomerations that are in the head, they begin to thicken, become sclerotic, and they lose their prick. And so I have the Detroit in my mind, but not Detroit, the east side of Detroit. And if I got in too close a conversation, it would be a part of the east side of Detroit. So then I had a second life after all sorts of travel. I studied for a year in Canada. I studied in New York. I taught for 2 years in Southern California during the 60s. I was a leader of protests of all sorts. I helped organize for Chavez. I had a full California mind. But then I went to Southwest Minnesota. And we began to study Southwest Minnesota to carry out an important mission. We thought local history was the way to make a place a place. Without historians doing the local history and redoing it and being alive in their arguments, not sclerotic, we don't have a place. The place just gets brittle like a leaf and blows away. The historians have to keep resurging memory, and we were trying to do that for Southwest Minnesota. There's a few other things I want to point out that make the Midwest difficult for me. By nature, I like to take things apart. And whenever I hear proposals of a whole, and it's in accord with Aristotle, I must take apart in order to distinguish and discern. My intellectual activity is to take apart. So the Midwest, I take it apart. The long route that took me out to southwestern Minnesota led, and I won't go through it all, but it led a long, long way to different places and different thoughts, including the discovery of my grandparents' home village of about 3 or 4 years in Anthracite, Pennsylvania. The town was called Clares, which is a contraction of the two Irish owners of the land, Kelly and Ayres. They got the last mining rights in Schuylkill County. And that town had one of the largest political massacres. It's a town of about 300 or 400. One of the largest political massacres in the United States in 1934. And it's down my wife's street. We're kind of cousins. Her father and her family was in one town. My Italian family was in the other. And they still interacted when she and I met. So I married my first cousin. But then when people get that look, you married your cousin, then I say, well, third cousin. But I argue it's better to marry a cousin than somebody you don't know. And there's a lot of French proverbs about that, and those are where the truth lies when you get older. You can study a lot of Immanuel Kant and Wittgenstein, blah, 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 but some good Sicilian proverbs and French proverbs, boy, that's where the eye and the brain and the tongue are. My favorite one in Sicilian is le cose lunghe diventano serpenti. Long things become snakes. So a long drawn-out engagement, better to marry your cousin. All right, we left California, Riverside. 2 children, third soon on the way, and well practiced in protest. I like leading nonviolent, symbolic protests. That was the mode. We arrived in Cottonwood, Minnesota. Thank God, a job. I'd love to just keep telling Southwest stories about who called me up and what I first saw and exchanges. They were calling the course I was supposed to teach flux. I mean, you know, it's kind of close to, why don't you teach chaos while you're at it? Anyhow. But in this little village, Norwegian Protestants wrapped around Lutheran churches, but the outer ring was Belgian Catholics. We had a little spike in town in a St. Mary's. Wonderful difference between the Norwegians who were losing the land and the more peasant-like but calculating Belgians who were taking the land. Just wonderful, 2 different mentalities. I'd do anything to have my kid work with a white collar. I'd kill my son if he won't take the land. It was wonderful. It was 2 traditional frames of mind. Then the Legionnaires decided we should have a cannon that was facing the grain elevator around Highway 23 in a small park. They wanted a cannon to commemorate the sacrifice of all who had died and we should be grateful for. And one of the professors, and not me, and I don't usually agree with him on issues, and I don't know if I would have agreed with him being so silly as to send in that letter. He wrote a letter saying, in this age, at this time, cannons are not a good thing. So he represented the party I would call the enlightened party, where we'll have a better and better future. So for me, he was that diffuse guilt, where until we're all we should have been and all we could be, we should be guilty. That seems to me to be the subconscious of the modern mind. We're not doing enough for our kids, we're not doing enough for this, we're not doing enough for this. It's that language. And then you might argue the alternative language, you should be thankful, you should be thankful, you should be thankful. That made for me the war of the canon. That a priest became mayor, that was another element. So in the little town of 800, we had full worlds. They were connected to St. Olaf, they were connected to Roly Rolvog, they were connected to Belgian farmers who could name their way across Flanders, and some were Dutch Catholics as well, and they could name their way into Holland. And it was a world. It was a whole world. And then we moved, my wife and I, we moved to actually where the college is, Southwest State, brand new college, and that, of course, was a bomb on the landscape. Hell's Angels had just zapped North Dakota. They were forming vigilantes. It was just the first group of blacks showed up to be students, and the only other people who'd seen blacks were people like myself from Detroit or soldiers in World War II. It was a landscape filled with shock, and we were also, as we were growing as a small college and struggling frightfully because the enrollments went down and everything was happening and we were forming unions. It was a real battlefield. As all that was going on, Swan's food industry, right in the same town, was beginning to sell pizzas all the way in western North Dakota. And that's a long way between each family farm to sell ice cream, and then they went to pizza. So the landscape was very dynamic. At the same time, when I go to the geographic landscape, Marshall, I'm not reading my text at all, sorry about that. Marshall was at the foot of the great structure that hasn't still received the book it deserves, the Buffalo Ridge or the Coteau de Prairie. That's a ridge of about 200 miles that cuts across the eastern Dakotas and comes into western Minnesota. Its elevation in Minnesota above Marshall was 700 feet, but it dropped 700 feet in 30 miles. The drop of the Mississippi from St. Paul to New Orleans is not nearly that great. We had rivers running. We had rivers all over the place, streams, creeks, wetlands. Our area is drainage is, who wants ditching and who wants to pay the taxes? You figure that out and you know the area. In California, it was you figure out who steals the water and you know the lie of the land. Over here, it's who wants to flood the other guy. The formula was upstream, I'm a conservationist. Everybody should have ducks on their farm. But when the water gets to my farm, all of a sudden we become civil engineers. How do we get rid of it and send it downstream? A flood was a major thing, but our waters flowed to the Hudson Bay. Our waters flowed to the Missouri. Our waters flowed to the Minnesota, which took it over to Fort Snelling and then on to the Mississippi. And other waters of ours snuck out through Iowa in various places and ended up at the Mississippi hundreds of miles later. So what does that mean? We were a continental watershed. If you live out there long enough, you adjust to seaside winds. Our average winds are about 9 or 10 miles an hour. They do everything, those winds, to the cold. We also have, in this flat, nondescript prairie land, we have a tremendous vein of quartzite red rock that forms the soft pipestone, but forms a hard rock that runs all the way through. Not far from where we live, we're in Marshall, we have petroglyphs that would make you feel you're in Sedona, Arizona by the color of the petroglyphs and the place. So it's a very exciting landscape, much less if you start to do tall grass, short grass. But we were in the land of the muskrat. I didn't say the more northern beaver. We were in the land of the muskrat. But nearby, not so far away, was the land of the buffalo. Came right by. So there was that contrast, and it showed in the Indian peoples too. Do you go for local muskrats, or you get a horse and go out for the big game? So we had a land that we were learning a lot about environmental studies. That ridge I was talking about caused climate change. So we began studies. My friend Ted here, there were all sorts of ethnic groups. The area's pockmarked with different ethnic groups: Polish, German, Czech, Dutch, Belgian, the Scandinavian groups, older English groups. The House of the Prairie kept jumping all around us. For a while it was in southern Minnesota, then it went out to South Dakota. I mean, the family of there. So we were learning a lot about ethnicity. At the same time, we had a lot of good writers. And Dave Pekaski was publishing them and collecting them, but we had the Blyes. We had Paul Grukow from Worthington, outstanding writer. We had Leo Dangle, a South Dakota poet, who I think is still one of the super poets. We had Phil Dacey, who was a national poet. When it came to writing conferences, that college, I think, was far in advance of the University of Minnesota and by far everyone else. So, boy, I bragged that place up, didn't I? But the point was, in a locality, in a specific locality, one that's exploding in newness or things are happening, the point exceeds the place. I never thought of doing Minnesota history, but I certainly thought of doing Southwestern history. The border of South Dakota? Well, I'll cross that if that's where the ridge goes. Hell, Iowa. I don't care if it's Iowa or it's Minnesota. If the ridge goes down there or the Dutch come from up there, I'm not going to politely ask for permission to cross the border with my mind. If I follow the native Indians in their exile after the 1862 war and then watch them come from the central Dakotas back into our area and how they migrate back, I'm not going to observe borders. I'm going to follow people or families or traditions or cultures. I did other studies too. I did a murder, father and son that killed two bankers. It was our Kennedy murder in about a 60-mile diameter. You knew exactly where you were, if you locked the door, who was running, who had guns. You knew it all. And there were 10,000 white pickup trucks sighted. 10,000 people saw the white pickup truck the day they fled. They eventually went to Paducah, Texas. The father was found dead. The son turned himself in. He looked AWOL. Then the question, how did the father die? The whole thing haunted us with its symmetry of father and son, that close they killed together. Which one was the shooter? That wasn't much a mystery. The son was the shooter. That was only a mystery for people who want to blame everything on parents. I mean, the whole thing on parents. That wasn't a mystery. But we were also beginning to deal with that type of young person that militarizes their anger in nitrogen fertilizer bombs, military practicing shooting with an M1. Wasn't a typical farm, and he wasn't a typical farmer's son, and in fact, they hadn't lost the farm. In the New York Times book, it was a farm murder. When I looked at it, it was an aberrant adolescent of which the nation, the world is filled. So it wasn't a local farm murder. When you looked at the father-son relationship, and particularly the son, it was almost primordial. Fathers and sons should never get too close together, especially when there's no mom to keep them apart. They're bad, that's bad blood. And there are books written on the Midwest about that, about the guy and a father and son who captured the the Olympic runner up in Montana. The book is called Incident Under Big Sky. It'd be very interesting if any of you like crime. There are not that many father and son murders. If I'm going to kill someone, I'm going to hide my sons. I'm going to keep them away. I'm going to have them have an alibi. Or if they're going to kill someone, I'd hope they'd do the same for me. But I was fascinated they went together. Then in the same year of the murder came to head an 18-month largest crop scam in American history. It was headquartered in Marshall, Minnesota, the Jerusalem artichoke. It involved people returning from the dead to testify to the indigenous spirituality of this plant. It would save the Midwest with ethanol. And if that didn't work, it'd help diabetics with insulin, sugar. And if that didn't work, you could feed it to your hogs. And if that didn't work, you could kind of get some good ones, because it's not really quite tamed or domesticated as a plant, but you can get some good ones and sell them as water chestnuts in highbrow restaurants in Southern California. $30 million they sold in 18 months on, I'm going to call it a Ponzi scheme, but it was an evangelical matchbook minister Ponzi scheme too. It was marvelous, just marvelous. We got TV evangelists and we got professors from universities who traded their white coats in. Artichokes tended to cause flatulence, and that gave the artichoke story a kind of a smell, an underside, which I delight in that. I'm a big reader of Rabelais. I read Montaigne when I'm serious, but when I want to cackle, I read Rabelais. Okay. So a local place became global. Dave Pekoski and I wrote a essay photograph book, and he does the photographing, called A Place of Many Places. And I'd like everyone to believe their place is a place of many places. Because if you make your place richer, my places get richer. And I think that's the issue of Midwestern history. If you can make our past richer so that enhances us in the present, you've served Midwestern history. If you fashion a canister and put us in the canister, then you're taking away our variety. So it's kind of a question of, is the classification a metaphor that allows you to participate in the world, or is the classification a generalization that allows you to fit and tuck in things into the way you want to think of them? Towards a conclusion, I do believe place counts. You'll see some books out there. There's even one called A Place Matters. But place matters profoundly, and I don't mean in any way to flatter historians in particular, but place is always measured by time. There's then and then again. So we're not dealing with place as static. And I must say, as much as I consider myself and my friends as local and regional historians, you must believe history is living and changing, and join Benedetto Croce in believing all history is contemporary history. Otherwise, you will cite those cliches that have been said so many times. People will dry up and go away like those leaves blowing out of that cemetery. You must find the vital issues. So when I would look at Marshall or Cottonwood, I'd want to find out, are they changing the material they're building drainage ditches with? How does an auto repair shop sound today? How did an auto repair shop sound 30 years ago? How are farms changing? Dave was very good on this. How are your structures changing? Aside from groups, very interested, and that we get to what I really worked on a great deal was two factors. I was very taken by the rate of turnover. And you can use that off the 5-year census. How many people were where you're studying in the last 5 years? And you can use such rates and school records to find out who the newcomers in your area. You can count apartments versus houses. And you can capture the turbulence of what's going on, the speed of change. When you combine that, the size of farm, getting ever bigger, maybe at the rate of 10% a decade, they're getting bigger in our area from about 400 to 2,000 now, operable farms. And the farm families are going from like 10 and 12 down to 4 and 5, 3 sometimes. And if you know about wills, that's very tricky stuff when you don't have any kids to leave your land to and you got that much land. You got an accordion, and the average age of the small towns. And I did most of my work in the late 80s on census, but I already could see a pattern and predicted the 90 census on the basis of following numbers from 50 on. The rules are very simple. Farms get bigger. Farm families get smaller. Farmers get older. Small places diminish, decline, vanish. Big places get bigger, but they're less and less traditional. Eventually, you even have college teachers sitting on the city council because you can't get a local businessman for one or two reasons. He's the only guy left, and he does either. He'll lose the Republicans or the Democrats, or there's none of them left anymore. Study a hardware store, the evolution of hardware stores in southwestern Minnesota, their products, how they had to join. Study furniture stores. You'll see that our area is emptying inside out. And we're the heartland of the Midwest. And why do I say that 100-mile swath going north to south is the heartland? Because we've not yet been overrun by the Detroits, the Chicagos. We had lots of institutions. We're not as vacant as the Western Dakotas. Some of those towns began to die after they were 3 years old. The railroad pulled up the town was growing, the train pulled away, the town was shrinking. It's almost that quick. John Hudson does a great study of North Dakota on that, wonderful stuff. But we were at the center, we had all these institutions, we had all these barns, we had all these ethnic groups for a very short slice in time. But they're tending to vanish. And something's being lost that is once and for all. Be it memories, be it institutions, be it landscapes. It's being lost once and for all. And that gives you the deadly seriousness of history. Okay, I think I gave you a feeling for that. But now, in fact, when this conference is over, I'm going to go to this Mount Olivet Cemetery. And there in Detroit, the east side of Detroit, if I think there's been a type of change in that Midwest of Marshall, Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, come with me to a trip on my side of East Detroit. It's just stunning. Where your grandmother's house was, there's weeds that tall, foxes running the field. Women don't go shopping. Those who do without mace, there's something like 150, or were. Maybe they've improved in the last few years, but the number of stray dogs in Detroit are more terrifying than the number of criminals. I'd be much more terrified of a hungry dog. But there's whole areas that are obliterated that in my boyhood were embering with blue welding torches. Detroit was making all that stuff. Everyone was prospering. They were starting to move out to the suburbs so they could imitate the rich, have a little bigger house, a little more space. That Detroit was past Philadelphia, fourth largest town, had great awnings, arches of elm trees. Detroit was in control. And they had the Detroit Tigers that won a few World Series, 45. They had a boxer called Joe Louis. They had a hockey team called the Red Wings. And I got to confess, they had a team called the Detroit Lions, who wasn't bad too. I mean, if you were a Detroiter, like I had to hear this from my folks to the point that I thought I was leaving Nirvana when I went to Ann Arbor, everything in Detroit was at the top. And if it wasn't at the top, it was damn near at the top. And that brings me to a major kind of thesis. On the prairie, I rather agree with Dick Davies' study of Camden, Ohio, that the 20s was the high point when the small town could feel that it was getting all the benefits of the nation and it was fully contributing in the nation. Town, state, Midwest, and America were all one, advancing wherever America was advancing. They had a doctor, they had a movie show, they had roads. Somebody showing me a sign, by the way? How much time I have? 5 minutes? 10. Oh, God, I have to filibuster now. I'll take questions in just a second. Not that I haven't been filibustering, but at that point, it was there. But somewhere in the 30s kind of, well, it goes by us because everybody's suffering equal. A lot of issues of the 20s kind of get washed in the 30s. And then in the early 40s, we're fighting a national war. That more or less washes the culture one more time. But after you get to 50, you have to be fairly blind not to see that the traditional places are falling behind, and they're falling behind steadily. The small are getting smaller. So that is the drama. When I go out now to the cemetery, I start dealing with myth, legend, religion. My father was the keeper of the graves. My father had a little bucket, a little tin bucket. He had a World War II trench shovel, the kind that you can screw together and turn it into a little bit of a digger, or you can just shovel with it. And he'd go out there. He'd say his Our Fathers, Hail Marys very quickly, put them back in the trunk, and I'd go along and I'd say my Our Fathers and admire my father. The older I get, the more I began to feel I'm truly a Roman. I've become, rather than the keeper of the hearth, I've become the keeper of the graves. That's my job, to keep alive the memories of the people. It's almost as if I'm a repository of the dead until the second coming. Then I can get them off my hands, and I can get myself off the hands of others. We can pass each other free of one another. So then I began, at that point, to architect the world in terms of fundamental Christianity, fundamental classic Greek-Roman thought. And that architecture of the world so is an exceed of national Midwestern cultures that I feel very comfortable in the Middle Ages. I go to Sicily. I go to Segesta. I see the sparrows flying in and out, but I feel like I could worship in that temple a little bit too. It's on my island. In other words, my soul begins to universalize. So this creates, for me, why I think in twos, perhaps. The mind must work, back to the Pope's statement, on two cities. It must work as profoundly as it can on a particular city, a particular place, and find the infinity or the multitude or plethora within the individual place. And at the same time, it must join all places in a kind of universality. We say, what the hell is he talking about? Well, you're historians. I'm talking really in the tradition of Vico and Herder. I'm talking about a flourishing history that remembers, in the word of my poetry book, to provide buoyancy to the past. The grace of your present mind with memory floats the variety of the past forward, so who's ever living can share in the variety of the past, and you hope somehow or other you will. And I'll read the last lines from a poem. I wasn't planning to do this, but then I'm never planning to do anything when I start to talk. The title's called Buoyancies. My uncle went to World War II. He joined up right away at Pearl Harbor, got on a refurbished passenger ship, went to North Africa. The ship he was on, never get on a ship with this name, was called the Bliss. It deposited its troops on the north shores of Africa, went out in bay a little bit, but supposedly behind the fencing. A German U-boat got behind the fencing, sunk his ship and 3 others. He took his dead friend overboard with him into the sea and kept his dead friend with him for 12, 18 hours afloat. Now that raises the terrifying thing. Was my uncle doing not terrifying, but provocative thing? Was my uncle keeping the dead guy afloat because he didn't want his body, if you wish, to go to the depths or be eaten by the sharks or what? The dispersing seas. Or was that the only life raft he had at that moment, a friend that he once loved? And it's got that wonderful latitude. But I went with that uncle after World War II, and I won't talk about all his missions and all that, all of which is a part of my mind. It's part of my Ulysses. I went with my parents to return that uncle to the east side of Detroit. Because where was he? He was married, had a child, and was living in Boston in the apartment above the mother, she was a widow, of the son. He couldn't break from there. 5 minutes, and here's the last poem, and I think I'm going to finish on time. I'll read you a few stanzas of it. It's the last poem. In the summer of 1947, when I was 8, I drove with my father and mother to Boston to reclaim Bill, that's my uncle, and Margaret, and their new infant daughter, Mary Ellen, for our Detroit family. All the way home, every time Mary Ellen saw a body of water, she cried out the first and only word she knew, Gunga, Gunga. And we laughed. I got a little sick of it after a while, but it was kind of funny too. And now, a half century later, what seems a flood of time ago, since the trip of reclamation with my beloved grandparents, Bill and Frances, long gone, my very own Joe and Ethel, and even Bill and Margaret dead, I keep them together and afloat in the dispersing seas of time. I do this with the buoying grace of memory and the treading kick of word and story. And that's what I would have historians do as well. Keep alive your dead with that sharp kick and keep things afloat. Any questions? I'll be glad to take them. Thank you. Oh, that solves it. Oh, Ted, yeah, please.
During this conference, we've been talking about where the Midwest is. With your wonderful talk, I love this thing. You were talking about history being the history of our contemporary times. But that contemporary time requires us also to place ourselves temporally also in the past.
It's a marriage. It's a marriage between past and present and present and past.
Now, is there a definitive Midwest back in time that we have to learn? Is there one place?
Well, I simplified that terribly, and I went to town rather than farm. Farm would have been more complicated for me. And I didn't go to large town, but that's why I used Richard Davies. And I used the 20s, moving into the 30s. And it's at that point, these towns had what I would call a full deck. They could reach what for me is a very important theory of all rural life. Specialization outruns place in the modern age. As a result, our companies are far away, our government's abstract. But at that time, the small town folks, in all their prejudices and their narrowness, they could feel complementarily full with what the people had in the neighborhoods and the cities, and they could feel participatory in the nation. I don't know how you live in these small towns and feel like I can see how you're participating. Your Social Security check comes, bills come, but how you feel in your community that you're in any way have a full life of institutions. You might be now driving quite a bit further, hauling your kids further. You don't have a school left. You don't have a church even left nearby. How you feel you're participating in that America, it's gone. So 20s. That's.
Okay, but then, so is there a Midwest in the future?
I would argue the Midwest will continue to vanish, but it'll have resurgences because it was a fundamental container. And as a fundamental container, when it's reinvigorated, it will provide new insights to regain things. But what I am trying to suggest, and I'm being fairly radical, and I haven't quite finished the last chapters of a book I'm writing on everyday life right now. But I'm willing to put forward for this group and for argument the notion that even everyday life is exploding into mind, and mind is exploding into placelessness in all places, and we're being decored of our materiality. So this sets up a paradox. While I think we're becoming more mental, I think we should be more material, but only more material so we have more metaphors and more spirituality so we can reach further in thought. You know how I think. I just won't deal with spades. There's got to be hearts. That was no. Well, I hope that was an answer, but it probably wasn't.
Thank you very much, Professor Amato. We have run out of time. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I now want to let you all go have that 15-minute break, and then we're going to reconvene here at 2 o'clock with our press panel. We're going to have reporters from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Chicago Tribune. We'll see you in 15 minutes.
Thank you.